instead promises relief from some general malaise, alienation.
Side note, something I noticed while editing this video here, that is not Marxist theory of alienation. Marxist theory of alienation is not some general malaise. Marxist theory of alienation is very specific, and it happens in the process of production. When the worker goes to work and puts his labor into a product, that product then becomes the property of a capitalist who didn't put his labor into the product, alienating the worker from the product of his own labor. This is Marxist theory of alienation. And I know it's hard to understand as maybe like a Twitch streamer because you're not actually involved in the process of production, but you should at least read what Marx was talking about before lying to your audience about what his theory of alienation was.
And so ironically, it can have the same opiate effect that Marx ascribes to religion, but release from the general anguish of human existence is not a political goal. There's been many revolutions in the last few centuries, and so far, 0 utopias. Resentment, envy, and hunger, for that matter, are not satiated by the downfall of the old regime. When the people have no bread, they eat the rich. And when the rich are gone, they eat each other. And because of the proximity effect, envy may actually increase after the revolution. You may actually be more envious of a favored comrade, a successful citoyen, oui, a kulak, than you ever were of the aristocrats. So envy turns paranoid and imaginative in revolutionary moments. It gets sublimated into morality, and the accusations start flying. That citizen is conspiring against the revolution. That peasant is hoarding grain. So the guillotine starts slicing thousands of heads off, the gulags fill up, or an authoritarian strongman takes over just to announce another revolution 2 decades later. The things people will do to stay relevant, honestly. And for what? What long-term egalitarian utopia results? Socialism with Chinese characteristics? Sociology instead promises relief from some general malaise.
Oh, pain. Please, people. Please. If you're on the left, if you call yourself a leftist or a Marxist, stop saying Marx wanted a utopia. Him and Engels wrote entire books like this one about how their version of socialism is not utopian. They said if our strategies and our theories are proven wrong, disregard them and change them because we are not utopians. And our version of society, our socialism and communism that we want to create is specifically different from utopic forms of socialism that had existed previously. What they talk about in this book is previously anarchist thinkers or thinkers like Fourier or capitalists like Robert Owen were trying to conceptualize and create perfect societies where everyone lived in harmony. Marx and Engels said that is ridiculous. There's no such thing as a utopia. Through class struggle, society moves through different modes of production, changing the relations of production. In Europe and England, where Marx and Engels were looking at, it transitioned from feudalism into capitalism. Feudalism had contradictions, capitalism has contradictions. And because humans are smart, because we have the ability to think and analyze, we can look at capitalism, see its contradictions, see these things like the capitalist class is constantly sending workers to fight and die in wars for capitalist expansion overseas for their own enrichment, or we can see that people that we produce enough food to feed everyone, yet millions of people starve to death every year. And we can see these contradictions and these externalities that come from the contradictions, and we can build a society, construct a society that fixes these contradictions. And because society moves through class struggle and feudalism and slave society transition to capitalism through revolutions and through class struggle, and we can see that of course there's going to be more revolutions and new modes of production in the future that will evolve out of our current one. And if you look at the two classes, the antagonistic classes in capitalism is the class who doesn't work yet takes all the money, and the class who works and has all their money stolen. And that's why Marx spent thousands and thousands of pages analyzing how capitalism works in Capital, so future societies can figure out ways to construct construct new societies and new systems that get around the contradictions of capitalism. So, they say, oh, this doesn't work because as soon as you have a revolution, there's just more revolutions, or Stalin just starts killing everyone. Okay, sure, you could disagree with the people Stalin killed, but they had 0% homelessness. They increased literacy, including women's literacy, to 99% from 20%. They had more women in their political structure than any other country in the world at the time. Did I say they got rid of homelessness? They industrialized the country and raised the standard of living. She talks about Stalin withholding grain, talking about the famine that happened in the Ukraine. prior to Stalin and the Russian Revolution, where the workers took power and greatly increased their standard of living, there were famines all the time. Famines were incredibly frequent, but economic planning and finding ways to increase the productive forces and get around the contradictions of capital to provide enough material needs for everyone created a vastly better society for them. You hear her talk about China here. China is constructing socialism, at least they're attempting to, right? You could say that China no longer has dictatorship of the proletariat. There's too much private capital in their country. There are all these critiques of China, but what they're trying to do is construct socialism. And, if anyone from America or any anarchist could just actually read what Deng Xiaoping, Mao Zedong, or Xi Jinping have written, you can see their whole goal is to carry on the Marxist tradition of building socialism through improving the quality of life and attacking the contradictions of capital in practice, through slowly constructing a society that puts workers in power and abolishes the bourgeoisie. And the result of this in China has been 1.4 billion people being raised out of poverty. Their entire population being raised out of poverty. No, that's not socialism. No, that's not a utopia. But Marxism was never supposed to be a utopia, right? Marxism is supposed to be how modes of production move, how class struggle moves society through different modes of production. And it's supposed to be the working class taking political power and, yes, eventually doing these things like moving away from commodity production, right, and completely abolishing the relations at the core of society. But the first thing they want to do is increase the standard of living for workers, especially in places like China, where prior to the revolution, their productive forces had been held in power, prevented from developing and purposefully prevented from feeding their people by the imperialist powers in the West. So to look at that and be like, these countries have done nothing, and this is why Marxism failed, because Marxism promised a utopia. No, it didn't. You don't know what you're talking about, and you're misleading your audience of millions of people while you pretend to be a leftist. You're misleading your audience about leftist theory while you act to be a proponent of the left. I mean, you might as well be a conservative at this point. That's how much, it's almost worse, right? Because at least conservatives make really dumb points and you can point out how they're wrong. ContraPoints is intelligent and she's misleading people about Marxism either because of ignorance or on purpose. So really disappointing to see that video there. Brings a tear to my eye. I'm shocked, I'm shocked that some of the breadtube creators are still lying about Marxism. If you bring up China in general, the vibes change instantly. It's wild. I know how it is. Just transparent Orientalism. Yeah, and so look, there's like an anarcho-communist on TikTok who I really like. Hoffman is their name. Hoff the Chain is the name of their TikTok account. They're an anarcho-communist, right? They don't necessarily believe in dictatorship of the proletariat, which transitions us to a socialist society, and hopefully the state withers away, right? The way that I just described Marxism. They say, I'm an anarcho-communist, right? So I defer from Marxism, and I defer from Marxist ideology, and I want a more decentralized revolution that immediately gives the means of production to the workers or whatever. Okay, great. That's wonderful. I'm so glad you have that opinion, Hoff the Chain, and I will discuss that opinion with you all day. But what Hoff the Chain doesn't do is say, I'm an anarcho-communist and China distorts Marxism, right? China isn't Marxist, and everything China's done is bad and wrong, right? They can still look at China and say, okay, this is, they're attempting to do a dictatorship of the proletariat, like Marx said, the working class is attempting to use state power to transition to a socialist society, right? That is Marxism. I might disagree with it, but I'm not going to say this isn't Marxism and Marxism is always bad and then misrepresent what Marxism even means, right? Be an anarcho-communist, but don't lie about Marxist countries, and then when you live in the imperialist West, like ContraPoints, don't look at countries like China, who have kicked out the colonialists and kicked out people like the British who purposefully got the Chinese working class addicted to opium so they'd be easier to enslave, and look at everything China's built in kicking out those imperialists and bringing their people out of poverty and say, this is horrible and wrong and bad because of authoritarian policies that I disagree with that the Chinese government did. Like, why do you get to decide, China's path forward? And why do you, as a Westerner living in the capitalist, liberal, brainwashed United States, get to decide what Marxism is and decide if China's Marxist or not?